I'd like to welcome everyone to the second of our two IR Honors Conferences this year. My name is Erica Gould, and I am the director of the IR Honors Program and a lecturer in International Relations. And today we're pleased to have presentations by Erica Scott and Maili Yee. Last week we heard presentations from Emily Bishko and Veronica Kim. And these four students have been working since last April on their IR Honors theses. It's been my pleasure to work with them over this time period. Writing an honors thesis is an enormous and yet enormously rewarding undertaking. Students are able to focus on a research question for more than a year, explore the literature, and conduct original research in order to make a contribution to the field. Theses provide a unique opportunity for students to shift gears from being consumers of knowledge to being producers of knowledge. And in the best of times, writing an honors thesis is a massive achievement, the product of a year's worth of work, rigorous research, writing and rewriting, emotional highs and lows. This year, it is even more of an achievement. Students needed to complete their research without an additional trip to France or to the archives in Hawaii, as in the case of today's two speakers. And while writing from home and without the benefit of their on-campus community, resources, and workspace. Despite these challenges, all four IR honors students have produced excellent pieces of honors research, and I'm thrilled that you'll be able to hear about two of these projects in depth today. Today's IR honors students explored questions which were initially motivated by personal experiences, including conversations when studying abroad and experiences in secondary education. Over the course of more than a year, they turned those interests, those initial motivations, into ambitious research projects answered by reading the existing literature and secondary materials intensely, but also conducting an original experimental survey and digging through archival material in Hawaii. Both have conclusions that speak to the broader literature and have far-reaching implications about how we understand the impact of ethno-racial data collection on national identity and the role that Native communities and leaders played in helping to establish educational institutions and encourage literacy in the face of settler colonialism. I want to thank their IR Honors Thesis advisors for making these projects possible and for all of their work with these students this year, Dr. Karen Biesman, Professor Lauren Davenport, and Dr. Robert Rakoff. I'd also like to thank Professor Ken Schultz, the Director of the Program in International Relations and Professor of Political Science, Dr. Paul Festa, the Program in International Relations Associate Director, and Lynn Tran, the Program in International Relations Student Services Administration, as well as the faculty, friends, and most importantly, family who are joining us today. Briefly, I want to review some of our meeting rules as the conference is going to run from about 12 to 2. This meeting is being recorded, so you should be aware of that. All audience members should, as I mentioned, be muted for the entire presentation unless they're called on by me, the moderator. Erica will present for 30 minutes. This will be followed by about 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer. Then we'll have a short break and then the second 30-minute presentation by Maili, which will also be followed by 20 to 25 minutes of question and answer. During the question and answer, we encourage questions. Hope you will ask one. In order to ask a question, please indicate that you have a question by texting me via the chat, and you will be called upon. And please do indicate your affiliation. For example, if you're a Stanford student, Stanford faculty member, or a Stanford student, faculty member, or a family member in the chat, but you don't need to indicate your question. And then at the end of the program, we will have a virtual reception for the family advisors and the IR honors students who can join us for a brief celebration. But without further ado, and for our first presentation, we have Erica Scott, Nations by the Numbers, Ethno-Racial Data Collection and National Identity in the United States and France, advised by Professor Lauren Davenport.
All right, thank you, Professor Gould. Let me share screen really quickly. Okay, can everyone see this? Great. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Before I start, I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Davenport, as well as Professor Gould and the entire IR Honors cohort for their support over the last year. It's been truly incredible working with you all. So I think we can all probably agree that 2020 has been quite an eventful year so far. But despite all of the bad news, there has been one exciting aspect. It is a census year. And if you've ever filled out the census or the SAT or any form of official paperwork in the United States, you've probably encountered some form of this question, which is the race question. And chances are you probably didn't think twice about it. However, the fact that we ask a race question on the census isn't necessarily intuitive because reporting your race isn't as simple as reporting your address. As the Census Bureau itself admits, the race question is inherently subjective. Modern scientific consensus holds that race has no biological basis, and social definitions of race are not at all clear-cut. But even though race is a social construct, it also has enormous political and social relevance. Otherwise, we wouldn't collect data on it at all. So this begs the question, what are the implications of having the government step in and draw fixed lines around something that's so fluid? And more specifically, for this thesis, I'm interested in implications for national identity. So like the US, France is a multicultural democracy, but unlike the US, it actually forbids most forms of racial and ethnic data collection. A major reason for this is a fear that sorting citizens into boxes will simply reinforce existing social divisions, that if the government divides the nation up into pieces, it'll simply undermine any sense of national unity. So this concern led me to my research question. How does ethno-racial data collection affect national identity formation? So for a quick roadmap, I'm going to start with a brief description of how my thesis fits into the existing literature. And next, I'll trace the evolution of the race question on the US Census throughout history. After that, I'll talk a bit about how a different set of norms regarding race evolved in France. Then I'll discuss an original survey experiment that I conducted. And then finally, I'll talk about some conclusions and takeaways from my research. So first, let's look at the literature on my on my thesis topic. So the way I see it, my thesis falls at the intersection of three established fields of literature: racial formation theory, the relationship between race and census taking, and social identity theory. So we'll start with the idea of racial formation. This relates to what I discussed earlier, the fact that notions of race are socially constructed. Omi and Winant define racial formation as, quote, the process by which social, economic, and political forces determine the content and importance of racial categories, and by which they in turn are shaped by racial meanings. So in other words, there's a process of reciprocal negotiation between how categories are politically defined and what they mean. So one concrete example of this is the common stereotype in the US that Black people are less educated than white people. Centuries of discriminatory policies limited African Americans' access to quality education, but these policies both resulted from a belief in Black inferiority and also served to actualize that belief by creating educational disparities between Blacks and whites. So this just demonstrates how race both shapes and is shaped by the laws that define it. And a natural extension of this idea is the fact that census bureaus play a major role in racial formation. Melissa Nobles explores this idea in her book Shades of Citizenship, writing that, quote, racial enumeration itself creates and advances concepts of race, bringing into being the racial reality that census officials presume is already there. So in other words, the race question on the census isn't a neutral accounting of America's demographics. It actively shapes how we define and understand race. Finally, my thesis relates to social identity theory, which discusses how individuals choose to categorize themselves with different identity categories, such as racial identity or American national identity. And specifically, I'm interested in the concept of multiculturalism, often called cultural pluralism, which is the idea that a nation can contain a variety of different racial and ethnic groups that are all equally valued. And this is different from the assimilationist idea of the American melting pot, in which all cultures kind of blend together in a homogeneous whole. Multiculturalism is more of like what I would call a salad bowl idea, where each culture retains its unique characteristics, and American identity is composed of this assortment of discrete groups. So to briefly recap, my thesis explores kind of this triangle of associations between census categories, racial group identity, and national identity. The literature describes each of these relationships in isolation, but my thesis adds something to the conversation by exploring them together. So next, I'll give a quick overview of how racial categorization evolved in the United States. And just to situate ourselves time-wise, so the US Census has been collected every 10 years since 1790, and in many ways, it has reflected the trends that have occurred during each historical era of US history. So why does the US Census collect racial data at all? Well, the first answer is that the Constitution says so. Far from being colorblind, the US Constitution is quite color conscious. And what you see here, Article 1, Section 2, establishes the decennial census. And first it says that the purpose of counting people is for the allocation of taxes and representation in Congress. But then it lays out three categories that the census must distinguish. First, there are free persons, then Indians not taxed, and then finally the mysterious 3/5 of all other persons. And though they might not seem like it initially, these categories are essentially the first racial categories. Free persons refers basically to white people. Indians not taxed describe Native Americans who were still living on tribal land. And the all other persons in the 3/5 clause refers to slaves. But it's worth noting that these first racial categories establish the boundaries of citizenship more than anything else, because only free whites were considered full citizens at this point. However, moving into the 1800s, the race question begins to take on a different tone. Scientific racism was on the rise, and that's the idea that different racial groups are biologically distinct, with whites being biologically superior to Blacks and to other colonized peoples. So American scholars like Josiah Nott, whose work you see here, use census data to make arguments about the inferiority of Black people and to justify slavery. In this era, the census also introduced a mulatto category, which aimed to investigate the unique characteristics of mixed race people as compared to, quote, pure race people. In the late 1800s, the census began to grapple with increasing immigration from both Europe and Asia and Europe and Asia. As you can see, Chinese, Indian, and Japanese were all added as colors to the census during this time. However, despite large numbers of immigrants also arriving from Europe, we don't see Irish and Italian getting added to the race question. So this suggests that Asian immigrants were racialized by the census in a way that European immigrants were not. And it's something that I argue has had lasting consequences on how we still perceive Asian Americans as a distinct racial group, whereas European immigrants have kind of blended into mainstream whiteness by many accounts. In addition, in the 1890s census, you can see how the scientific racist idea of blood quanta led to the formation of the quadroon and octoroon categories, which describe people with 1/4 and 1/8 Black blood, respectively. However, these fractional categories quickly disappeared with the advent of Jim Crow in the South, and by the early 1900s, the mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon categories had disappeared. Anyone with the tiniest fraction of Black ancestry was marked as Negro by census enumerators, and this was commonly called the one-drop rule. And another interesting thing that happened during this period was controversy surrounding the 1930 census, which was the first census to add Mexican as a racial category. This category was added in part due to kind of a nativist backlash against Mexican immigrant laborers during the Great Depression. However, prominent Mexican and Latin American advocacy organizations actually mounted a huge lobbying effort to get rid of the Mexican category because they were afraid that singling out Mexicans on the census would inevitably lead to Jim Crow style discrimination. So as a result, the Census Bureau actually dropped this category, and in 1940, Mexicans were reclassified as white. In 1960, the Census Bureau made an administrative change that would have enormous implications for racial and national identity. For most of its history, the Census Bureau would send enumerators to households in order to count them. So for the race question, this meant that enumerators would often look at a person and guess what race they were and then write that down. But in 1960, the census switched to self-identification, which meant that individuals would receive a census form in the mail and then mark their own race. And this is important for two reasons. First, this meant that choosing a racial category now reflected how you personally identified, not how the government chose to identify you. So this is first and foremost a shift towards recognizing race as a social construct and social identity, and not a biological fact. Second, the civil rights and anti-discrimination policies that came out of the 50s and 60s, such as affirmative action and equal opportunity and employment, they relied on racial data in order to reveal discrimination. So now, answering the race question not only had implications for your personal identity, but it also had implications for how your racial group received representation, political attention, and financial resources. The importance of this change cannot be overstated. For the first time, organizations like the poster you see here, which is from the Coalition for a Black Count, began to organize to rally racial group members to identify a certain way on the census. And this is still common today. Racial and ethnic groups really want to make sure that they're counted correctly so that their communities can receive more attention and resources. So since the civil rights era, there have been two other major changes to the census. The first is the advent of the Mark 1 or more option, which was introduced in 2000 after lobbying by multiracial activists. And the second is a trend towards the disaggregation of categories. So people often complain that categories like Black and Asian are too broad. And there are a lot of other ethnic groups, like, for example, Arab Americans, that say that they deserve a separate census box. So in recent census forms, particularly 2020, you can see how many more different categories and write-in options have been added. And so these two trends both directly relate to the role the census plays now in identity formation and resource allocation. So a couple of takeaways from US history. So I think it shows that ethno-racial categories have been used to both exclude minorities from a white conception of nationhood, but also they've served as an inclusive basis for achieving civil rights and group representation. In addition, the merging of what I would call a civil rights era politics of representation with a 21st century identity politics has important implications for the coherence of American national identity. Specifically, the incentives that are now attached to having a box on the census, coupled with the idea that this box should represent your deeply held social identity. These trends are likely to reinforce the importance of subgroup membership in our politics. And this implies that the trend of disaggregation, right, more and more boxes, is likely to continue. And if American identity isn't pluralistic enough to accommodate this array of powerful subgroup identities, they could potentially undermine a shared sense of Americanness. So next, I'll discuss the history of how France arrived at a very different set of norms when it comes to racial data collection. So in France today, ethno-racial data collection, precisely the kind that we see in the US, is essentially forbidden by law. And as this Charlie Hebdo cartoon shows, it's also quite unpopular. Many French people will associate it with racism and xenophobia. So this modern taboo has its roots in several things. The first is the discriminatory past of the French census itself. So during World War II, France was occupied by Nazi Germany, and France's wartime government effectively functioned as a Nazi puppet state. In 1941, the French government carried out a special census of Jews, and the data was referred to as the Fichier Juif, the Jewish file. And this really marked the French government's complicity in the Holocaust. And so from the French perspective, this historical episode shows that government persecution of minorities is the ultimate danger of racial data collection. And this wasn't the only time the census was used for discriminatory ends in France. This also occurred in the case of colonization and decolonization. So Algeria was unique among French colonies because it was so integrated with the metropole. Had a very large population of European settlers called Pieds Noirs, and it was considered to be more than just a colony or a protectorate. It was considered to be an overseas department of the French state, so it was a part of France. And this allowed Algerians to have freedom of movement back and forth between Algeria and metropolitan France. And actually, after 1946, Algerians were legally considered to be French citizens. When France desperately needed power or manpower during and after the World Wars, it recruited Algerians who fought on the battlefront, as you can see in this photo from World War I, and also worked in factories and construction sites after the war. Because of the freedom of movement principle, many of these Algerians settled permanently in metropolitan France, and they brought their families with them, creating for the first time a permanent Muslim population in many French cities. So this, of course, caused a lot of anxiety and xenophobia, which only got worse during the 1950s when the bloody conflict over decolonization increased anti-Algerian sentiment in France. So what could the French government do? It wanted to track this new problem population, but Algerians were essentially invisible to the census. The French census at this point did not ask about race because after the Holocaust, that would have seemed incredibly distasteful. And moreover, Algerians were technically French nationals and French citizens, so they couldn't be labeled immigrants. So in order to get around this, INSCE, which is France's census agency, began to do something kind of bizarre. They began internally reclassifying census forms based on the apparent ethnic origin of people's names. So basically, you would fill out the census form, and if the government decided that your name sounded Muslim, they would relabel you into this category called French Muslims from Algeria. And this internal category, which, mind you, never appeared once on the external census form people filled out, it was used in the 50s and 60s as a basis for government surveillance of Algerians and restriction of their access to welfare and other social services. So despite sharing this kind of discriminatory past of census behavior, there's kind of a divergence once you get to the 70s, because while the US doubled down on its use of racial categories to promote civil rights, France actually did quite the opposite. After decolonization, it moved to adopt a rather colorblind legal framework that heavily restricted the government's ability to collect any sort of sensitive data that would reveal someone's racial or ethnic origin. And the reasoning was precisely because it could be used for discriminatory purposes. And a law passed in 1978 really is what established these norms going forward. But I would note that this law, in addition to protecting people's data privacy, also enshrines a certain conception of French national identity. So French republicanism, which is the political tradition that is related to the values of the French Revolution, there's what some might call an indifference to differences, which is the idea that in a unified, equal republic, all citizens should be French above all other identities. And this same idea is behind, I would say, an infamous 2004 law that banned religious symbols in French public schools, most notably the Muslim hijab. And the thought process behind this was that public schools, as an entity of the state, should be blind to any religious differences between students. So proponents of this say that institutional colorblindness prevents state-sanctioned discrimination. However, critics say that it only serves a mainstream idea of French identity that is implicitly white and implicitly Christian. So let's do some takeaways from French history. I would note that the French criticisms of the American model of racial data collection actually do have some validity, right? Ethno-racial statistics can and have been used to facilitate discrimination and promote group-centric rhetoric. However, the French example doesn't give compelling evidence to the contrary, that maintaining a colorblind approach to data collection will somehow engender or foster social cohesion. And as this photo shows, which was taken during France's famous 2005 protests, French society is still very racially stratified. And the problem is that these divisions and inequalities are just harder to quantify because of this ban on racial data collection. So finally, I'll discuss an original survey experiment that I conducted on this topic. So the two historical case studies that I just discussed shed light on how ethno-racial data collection interacts with national identity and with intergroup dynamics on like a broader social level. But they don't explain how these categories influence identity on an individual level. For example, what goes through someone's mind consciously or unconsciously when they're asked to check a racial box on the census? And does this act of checking a box affect how they identify with their nation at large? So I used a survey experiment to address these questions in the American context. So some details about the survey that I did. I conducted it with the help of a grant from UAR, which I used to pay respondents for completed surveys. I posted it on a website called Mechanical Turk or MTurk, which is a site where users can complete tasks for compensation. And at the end of the day, my survey had 866 respondents, all of whom were 18 years of age or older and based in the United States. So I'll walk you through kind of the design of the survey. So here's a diagram of the flow. There was one fundamental question that I wanted to ask here, which was, does reporting your racial category make you feel less American? So in order to get at this, the first two questions of the survey asked, what is your race and how American do you feel? And for the treatment, so half the respondents were asked the race question first and then the American identity question. The control group was asked American identity first and then race. I also wanted to see if there was a difference between checking a box and then actually like writing out your race, like what the 2020 census allows you to do. So for a second treatment, I gave half of the respondents a multiple choice close-ended race question, and the other half got an open-ended write-in free response question. So just to quickly review, the first treatment is the ordering of the two questions, race and American identity. And then the second treatment is whether or not you got the mark 1 or more multiple choice or the open-ended write-in question. Okay, so for treatment 1, I came up with a couple hypotheses based on the historical analysis I did in the US case. So as I discussed, for minorities, racial categories have had a variety of positive and negative connotations ranging from scientific racism to civil rights. And if these negative connotations outweigh the positive, then I would expect non-white respondents to feel less American after reporting their race. But if the positive equals or outweighs the negative, then non-whites might feel equally, if not more American after reporting their race. Similarly, if American identity is understood by people to be truly multicultural, then we really shouldn't see a link between any one racial group and American identity. However, if Americanness is understood to mean whiteness, then we'd expect non-whites to feel less American after reporting their race, where whites would feel more American. And just so you're aware of the scale I'm using here, for the how American do you feel question, there were 4 responses: completely American, mostly American, not very American, and not at all American. So keep in mind this 1 to 4 ordering for the next couple slides. So the closer a number is to 1, that means the stronger the American identity was. So first, let's look at mean national identity by racial group, regardless of treatment condition. So as you can see, for all racial groups, people fell on average somewhere between completely American and mostly American. And I used whites as the standard of comparison and checked to see if the other racial groups had a statistically significant difference from the white mean. And as you can see, the only 2 groups that did were Latino respondents and Asian respondents. Asian respondents felt less American than did whites, but Latino respondents actually felt more American than did whites, which that result actually surprised me a little bit. And I speculate this could have something to do with the current political climate, where perhaps increased xenophobia against Latinos could push them to reassert their Americanness to a greater degree kind of in reaction. So next, let's look at mean national identity by race and by treatment condition. So let's start with treatment 1, which is the race American identity questioning ordering. And as you can see here, it has an effect on whites more than any other racial group, with white respondents feeling slightly more American after reporting their race. So this fits pretty well with my 4th hypothesis, which is that whiteness and Americanness are synonymous or at least mutually reinforcing. However, the same hypothesis would also predict that non-whites would feel less American after reporting their race, which we don't see in the data. One potential interpretation of this discrepancy is that whites are the only group for which, historically, the association between racial category and national identity has always been positive. Throughout US history, white has typically not meant anything less than American. By contrast, when it comes to minorities, there's kind of a range of positive and negative associations that might fail to produce any generalized effect. So next, let's look at the second treatment condition. And as you can see here, it only had a significant effect on Black people. Black respondents felt less American after printing their race in the free response box than they did after checking the multiple choice category. So this could be because an open-ended question requires some more thinking about one's racial category than simply checking a box does, which might feel kind of automatic to many Americans. So once again, this would support the idea that Americanness equals whiteness, because Blacks feel less American after thinking more about their race. However, it's not immediately clear why this effect only applies to Blacks and not to other racial groups, but it could have something to do with the fact that the Black-white divide has historically been the deepest racial division in the United States. So next I ran some OLS regressions to see how race functioned as a predictor of national identity once I controlled for other demographics like age, gender, income, and education. So once again, I used whites as the basis for comparison, and I ran 2 regressions, one with the close-ended race treatment and then one with the open-ended race treatment. So now you can see Blacks are the only group with a statistically significant effect on national identity. So when race is close-ended, Black identity corresponds to an increase in predicted national identity relative to whites, while when race is close-ended, the coefficient actually flips negative, corresponding to less national identity. So this just confirms that the relationship between Black identity and national identity was pretty closely tied to this open-closed race treatment condition. Finally, I wanted to get a sense of how my respondents were understanding American identity qualitatively. So the very last question of the survey was a long answer free response question, and it simply asked, what comes to mind when you hear the word American? And then I hand coded the different types of responses I got based on the words and themes that they contained. So this table shows some of the most common ideas that came up. And I'll talk through a couple types of responses that I saw. So many respondents mentioned what I would call kind of the cliche American concepts, things like freedom, patriotism, opportunity, etc. Others brought up some more, I would say, technical definitions of American identity, such as residence, birth, citizenship. And then finally, there's a group of responses that I was most interested in, ones that concerned race and multiculturalism. So interestingly, a lot of respondents talked about whiteness or white people when they were asked what it meant to be American, roughly as many as talked about diversity. Furthermore, more people brought up racism than brought up unity or the American melting pot, which I thought was very interesting. And so I broke these responses down by racial group just to see who was answering these types of responses. So I'll highlight just two examples here. Let's talk first about whiteness. So I actually found that Blacks were the most likely to mention whiteness, 3 times more likely than white people were. And this was fascinating because I found earlier, right, that white people felt more American after reporting their race. So it seems that although whiteness influences the national identity of white Americans, this doesn't appear to be a conscious association for them. But on the other hand, Black people seem to be very consciously aware of this association. So next, let's look at diversity. Perhaps unsurprisingly, multiracial people were the most likely to mention diversity, but also people who were politically liberal or identified as Democrats were far more likely to mention both diversity and whiteness than conservatives were. So taken together, the 2 parts of my survey experiment, the quantitative and the qualitative parts, show that choosing a racial category does influence American national identity, but that the nature of this relationship differs by racial group. Specifically, I found evidence for the idea that Americanness is related to whiteness, but that this link might be more subconscious for white Americans than it is for Black Americans. So finally, let's discuss some conclusions that we can draw from my research. So overall, my research illustrates that there's a multifaceted relationship between racial data collection, racial group identity, and national identity. And the US case in particular shows that historical racism, anti-discrimination politics, and identity politics all play a key role in understanding how racial categories interact with American national identity. The French case, on the other hand, shows that statistical colorblindness doesn't necessarily create social cohesion in a racially stratified society. And my survey experiment shows that racial data collection can influence people's sense of Americanness, but in a way that suggests that national identity is implicitly white. Ultimately, this all suggests that ethno-racial data collection can undermine a unified national identity, but only when that national identity isn't sufficiently multicultural. So put differently, if dominant understandings of Americanness or Frenchness are actually rooted in whiteness, then creating racial categories doesn't just invoke any social divisions. It invokes precisely the social divisions that historically have existed in tension with national identity. And in the US case, all of this kind of begs the question, what is the end game of racial census categories? Because according to current trends, the census will probably continue to have more and more racial options to choose from. But what good is that if racism is still pervasive? So if the US is committing to this idea that the basis of discrimination, which is racial categories, will also be the basis of remedy, then the future of these categories depends on how effective the remedy is. So that is, it depends on whether or not the policies that use racial data actually succeed in creating a more equal and pluralistic nation. So that is it. Thank you. And I look forward to taking your questions.
So for our second presentation, we have Maeli Makalua Yi, Confronting Settler Colonial Histories, Education, Race, and Politics in the Hawaiian Kingdom, advised by Karen Beastman. And I'm sorry, before you start, Maili, let me just say, there's a number of new people who are here. If everyone who's watching the presentation could be sure to mute. And then at the end of Maili's presentation, I will send out a message and you can respond to me directly if you have a question. And I will put you on the list in order to ask questions. And then you can unmute when I've called on you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and put it in presentation mode. And I guess I'll get started. Aloha mai kākou, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all to share my research on confronting settler colonial histories of education in the Hawaiian Kingdom. I think it only appropriate to acknowledge the people that made this project possible, beginning with the program in international relations, Professor Schultz, Dr. Paul Festa, and all of the staff. I'm grateful for Dr. Erica Gold for having faith in me and motivating me throughout this process. I'm grateful for my IR cohort, Erica, Veronica, and Emily. I'm pretty nervous to close this out because, as you could tell from their presentations, that they are amazing scholars, and I've been really blessed to get to work with them. This could not be possible without my advisor, Karen Beastman, and her invaluable direction and guidance. She is a champion of Indigenous peoples everywhere, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity I had to work with her. And I'm grateful for each of you, my friends and family, who have carried me throughout this process. My mom, who is my research assistant, going with me to the archives, my sister, my husband holding me through the tears. It's been quite a journey, and I'm really excited to get to share it with you all. I also want to acknowledge that though I am presenting this from my ancestral homelands in Hawaii, that the majority of this work was done at Stanford University, which sits on the territory of Puichon, the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County, and that this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. And I recognize that every member of the Stanford community, including myself, has and continues to benefit from the occupation and use of this land. I am grateful for their stewardship. So to get started, I know a lot of you are unfamiliar with my research, and I wanted to share what prompted me to do an IR thesis in education on Hawaii. So this is a picture of Punahou graduation. This is 2012, but it looks essentially the same as my graduation in 2014. I was one of 10 in my year that attended Stanford University the following fall. And that's a pretty high number, but it's consistent with the trend within Punahou as an elite college preparatory institution to prepare its students for higher education. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Punahou, some of the notable alumna include President Barack Obama in the top right, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And so Punahou is considered to be at the forefront of education in many ways in Hawaii. But despite this, while I was at Punahou, I realized that I learned very little about Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian history, and Hawaiian politics. When I arrived at Stanford, I discovered this through conversations with new friends in the Native community. And similar coursework was unavailable on indigeneity in many ways while at Stanford. And that's what prompted me to look at what is the role of education and who gets to determine what is taught in these places. So to give a brief overview of my research project, again, I'm looking at the history of education in the Hawaiian Kingdom. It started with a interest in the contemporary times, but initial research quickly showed that more research needed to be done on the Hawaiian Kingdom period, so prior to the overthrow in 1893. My initial questions are just who are the key players in shaping education? What was the role of the Hawaiian people, or particularly the Hawaiian elite or chiefs, and what was the role of the missionaries? Initial findings quickly showed that existing literature diminishes the role of Hawaiians in the establishment of Western education and privileges missionaries with the establishment. And further findings show that education is a political endeavor amongst the Hawaiian elite and particularly amongst the missionaries as well. And my objective throughout this process is simply to utilize Hawaiian primary and secondary source materials to contribute to a new historical interpretation. And I want to acknowledge that I have very little command of the Hawaiian language, unfortunately, so it relied on other scholars' translations, but I really tried to emphasize using Kanaka Maoli resources and scholarship. So an agenda for today, I'll begin by giving a historical background of Hawaii, situating my research and my research questions. I will then address the frameworks and methodologies that I use to answer these questions. I will give an overview of the existing literature, share my findings and conclusions and potential implications for further research. So to begin, a brief historical background of Hawaii. In 1810, Kamehameha I unifies the 8 Hawaiian Islands. In 1820, the first company of Calvinist missionaries arrives from New England in Hawaii. They're sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to send the gospel of Jesus Christ among foreign heathen nations. And they're inspired by the Second Great Awakening that they believe that successful conversion would raise the heathen from their degraded state and manifest itself in a Christian and New England lifestyle. So they have a both evangelical and civilizing mission. In 1820, through a collaboration between the Ili'i and former missionaries, they enact the first constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And this establishes a Western style of government that includes governors on 4 of the main islands, a House of Nobles that acted as a legislative body, a judiciary, and tax offices. And this also marks the creation of the public school system in Hawaii. In 1842, Kamehameha III dispatches a Hawaiian delegation to the United States and then to Europe to negotiate treaties and ultimately secure the recognition of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent nation state. And they receive recognition by President Tyler of the United States, King Louis of France, King Leopold of Belgium, and Queen Victoria of England by 1843. In 1887, a group of pro-annexationist white businessmen known as the Hawaiian League forced King Kalakaua to sign a new constitution at gunpoint, and so it's known as the Bayonet Constitution. And this constitution effectively reduces the executive power of the Hawaiian monarchy and places most legal authority in the legislature, which by this point is largely controlled by missionary descendants known as the Missionary Party. This constitution also places financial requirements on voting eligibility that effectively disenfranchises the majority of Hawaiians. And it also limits votes based on race, banning Asians from participating, but opens the votes to non-citizens, primarily benefiting American and European businessmen. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani is pressed by the large majority of Native Hawaiians to propose a new constitution and restore the powers of the monarchy and return pre-1887 voting rights. In response, the same pro-annexationist white businessmen overthrow the queen and declare themselves head of the provisional government, which is immediately recognized by the American military, which is stationed in Honolulu. The queen relinquishes the throne under fear of force and to avoid bloodshed. The provisional government immediately sends a delegation to the United States to ratify a treaty of annexation. However, President Cleveland withdraws the treaty and declares the overthrow and participation of the US military as illegal and defers to Congress to devise a resolution to reinstate the queen. The provisional government does not comply and renames themselves as the Republic of Hawaii in 1894 to await a more politically advantageous time for annexation. In 1896, the Republic repeals the previous education laws and institutes new government educational policies that marks the open suppression of Hawaiian in public schools. In 1897, after a new treaty of annexation fails to receive necessary votes for ratification in the Senate, the United States annexes Hawaii as a territory in 1898 through a joint resolution of Congress known as the Newlands Resolution. And following annexation, the project of Americanization is accelerated as reflected in the curricula to foster American nationalism in Hawaii. And ultimately, Hawaii is accepted as the 50th state in the United States. And so my research focuses predominantly a little beyond the Hawaiian Kingdom period into 1898, but is focused on this time period. And again, my initial questions were, who were the key players in establishing Western education in Hawaii? But after initial research, I found that the dominant historical narrative completely credited missionaries with the education in Hawaii, depicting education within a linear process of foreign domination. And so this prompted a new question for me about the role of Hawaiians, particularly the Hawaiian elite, in establishing the education system in Hawaii and prompting this new research question. Some sub-questions included what were the motivations for and the political implications of the elite involvement, and the same for the missionaries. And to answer this question, particularly the narrative gap that does not address Hawaiian participation in this process, I utilized settler colonialism as a theoretical framework. And settler colonialism is distinct from colonial and post-colonial theory in that it differentiates between different modes of domination and differentiating between extractive and settler colonies. Patrick Wolfe articulates how within extractive colonies, colonists' desires for natural resources means that they maintain the indigenous population as a labor force, whereas in settler societies, settler desires for land itself make the native population a target for elimination. And Wolfe summarizes this by saying settler societies are premised on the elimination of native societies. Invasion is a structure and not an event, and it's an ongoing process that continues today. Lorenzo Veracini adds to this distinction by identifying the various modes of transfer or elimination that are used. This includes necropolitical, the use of military force, ethnic transfer, assimilation methods, accounting, or we see that in blood quantum, literally counting natives out of existence, and the use of historical narrative. So historical narrative is in and of itself a mode of transfer by erasing indigenous peoples from history. Or it can be seen in depicting indigenous peoples, as you see here, as primitive or backward, thereby justifying their domination as inevitable. You see this in the tide of history rationale, and it's used to deny the legitimacy of ongoing indigenous presence and grievances. And ultimately, this narrative gap denies the settler presence and violence of formation. And I saw this in the literature when you're referring to the successful revolution that established the territory of Hawaii that denies the occupation and the violence and illegality of that process. Freire summarizes this in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed when he says, "The one who is doing the decreeing defines himself and the class to which he belongs as those who know or were born to know. He thereby defines others as alien entities." And we see this play out in the dominant historical narrative on education within Hawaii. This narrative depicts education within a linear narrative of American domination by portraying Hawaiians as uncivilized or incapable of self-governance and therefore destined for conquer, or as perpetual victims to missionary aims. And it's aptly summarized in this statement that Hawaiian sovereignty was first lost in the one-room schoolhouse. But nascent Kanaka or Hawaiian scholars push back against this narrative. Kamana Beamer in his work addresses the agency of elite and governments, particularly prior to the overthrow. Puakea Noglemeyer addresses the need for Hawaiian language material in historical research, that in the canon, or what's considered the canon of Hawaiian historical research, only 1% of the existing Hawaiian language material has been used. And so Noglemeyer argues that every assumption made over the last century should be revisited in light of those neglected sources to get a true understanding of that historical period. And so with this in mind, I shaped my methodology. And so I accessed different archival material. I visited the Hawaii Mission House archives, where they house missionary journals and letters. I found the Ali'i letters particularly interesting, which is the correspondence between Ali'i amongst each other, with the missionaries and with the American Board. I visited the Bishop Museum, where I found Hawaiian perspectives of the missionaries as translated by Kawena Pukui, and I visited Punahou School for my case study. And I supplemented my interpretations of these primary materials with Kanaka Maoli scholarship as well. And this is within what I refer to as an indigenous methodology. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, in her seminal work, Decolonizing Methodologies, addresses how research is implicated in the settler colonial process and how using indigenous methodologies and resources is a direct mode of resistance, and it's necessary in legitimizing and validating indigenous practices and knowledge in the academy. And so drawing from kaupapa Maori theory or Maori scholars in New Zealand, and from our own Hawaiian scholars who phrase it as mo'oku'ohau, or genealogy, as methodology. I shaped my own methods of looking at this material. Certain aspects that are emphasized in this methodology include developing the research question within community, that the question that I'm researching should be based on the needs of my community, and that the research process should be addressing those needs. This methodology also emphasizes the need for a personal connection and commitment to the issue, that in doing so you bring your personal mana or your experience and your background, and that this is a benefit to the research, which is contrary to colonial academic paradigms that encourage distance to reduce bias. This methodology also emphasizes the need for reflection and time, and particularly looking at and referring to ancestral ike, or knowledge. And this can take the form of looking at their records in written form. It can also be in conversation, in group settings, and it can be in dreams. And these are things that are considered indigenous ways of knowing and doing research. And ultimately, it is a community-based process, and it should be drawing upon and respectfully utilizing the knowledge within our communities. And given that I had limited time and I was mostly based at Stanford, I couldn't do this as much as I would like to, but in the future, when I do more research, I would like to do that. And so through this methodology, I discovered, I'll summarize my findings in 3 ways. The what did the LEE do? How are they involved? I found that the LEE provided crucial material, social, and political support to the missionaries in the establishment of schooling in Hawaii. The why. They did so as part of a larger project of cultural and political adaptation to combat foreign imperialism. And the implications of this is that by 1840, Western education became a crucial component of leadership in the Hawaiian Kingdom. So for my first findings, I'll just share some of the, I thought, more interesting primary documents that I found in resources that show these points. So in 1820, the missionaries arrived, the first company, and they immediately went to the LEE for permission to settle. And the LEE allowed them a 1-year limited trial period in which their instruction would be limited to the chiefs. From Bingham's journal, he notes, Bingham was one of the first missionaries, that after a negotiation of 8 days, it resulted in obtaining permission to settle in the islands and the patronage and protection of the government. In 1822, despite being initially limited to teaching the chiefs, the chiefs expressed great interest. And Ka'ahumanu, who at the time was the Queen Regent, and so basically the most powerful person in the kingdom, she doesn't convert until 1824. But we have records from her and letters that show that she was very much in favor of learning literacy from the missionaries. She writes to Kamamalu, another of the Inui, and she says, "They're among you the long necks," how they refer to the missionaries, and she tells her to send letters. "I want you to send 800 Hawaiian letters. We want literacy. It may make us wise." And so despite the restrictions on who the missionaries are teaching, as soon as any pupils acquired even a limited reading knowledge, they were sent out to teach others. And so by March 1822, there are 200 pupils in Honolulu, and by November of the same year, there are 15,000 students that are primarily being taught by native Hawaiians. In 1824, Ka'ahumanu extended teaching of Palapala and the Word of God to common people. And she institutes a law that requires that all people must learn the Palapala. And this is a political move that indicates to the Maka'ainana, or the commoners, that it is a requirement of them to do so. And this is a particularly important political support because there's a lot of hesitation about accepting the missionaries prior to this period. A document that I found in Bishop Museum shows this, as translated by Pukui, that some of the commoners would say, "We would not be converts or accept the missionaries until the chiefs are. The gods belong to the chiefs, and we will be converted after the chiefs." And so they will follow the example of the Li'i who hold that political, social, and religious authority. And from that period, from 1824 to 1827, there is a vast increase in the amount of students. By 1827, the whole adult population is receiving instruction in Hawaii because the chiefs provide the example to their people that this is what they believe they should be doing. And they also act as the first teachers. So after receiving the instruction, they immediately go out into different parts of the kingdom to teach others. John Kahuhu, who was one of the first who learned from the missionaries, in 1826, he notes that the people of this place greatly desired the written word. And within 5 months, he was preaching to over 400 students. By 1831, we see the language in the Ali'i letters that show Ka'ahumanu's view of this process. And she sees it very much as a collaborative effort with the missionaries to establish literacy and Christianity in the Hawaiian Kingdom. This letter that she writes, she indicates that after the missionaries learned the Hawaiian language, my elder brethren, them, the missionaries, the teachers, and my native brothers and sisters together will take up the will of our Lord in this archipelago. And together they will teach literacy and the gospel. My second finding is that the Ali'i support for schooling was not only crucial, but part of a larger foreign policy to resist foreign imperialism. That the Ali'i had already begun a process of political adaptation to deal with the increasing amount of foreign threats. After Captain Cook arrived in 1778, there was just a number of foreign ships that continued to arrive in Hawaii for the sandalwood trade and the whaling trade. And even prior to missionary arrival, Kamehameha I had adopted forms of Western politics. This included placing Hawaii under a British protectorate and also establishing governorships throughout Hawaii. And in 1819, Ka'ahumanu and the Ali'i Nui lead the abolition of the Aikapu, which the Aikapu was the traditional religious and social policy at the time. And Kumululilikala Kam'elehiva articulates this period as the metaphor for changing any aspect of Hawaiian society, and it encouraged an eternal imihaku, or the search for new paths to mana, or authority amongst the Ali'i, to manage the increasing number of foreigners and foreign threats that were arriving. By 1827, the Ali'i are implementing the new forms of literacy and policymaking that they are learning from the missionaries. They institute a law banning murder, alcohol, and prostitution in 1827 as a way to control the increasingly unruly foreign populations in Hawaii. And this is also a process of transforming Hawaii into an Aina Na'awo, or an enlightened nation to be recognized as civilized by the family of nations. In 1836, the Ali'i asked for more instructors to assist in this transition to an Aina Na'awo. They send a letter to the American board asking for new teachers. They're asking for a carpenter, a tailor, house builder, etc. And they ask for a teacher for the chiefs in matter of land comparable to what is done in enlightened lands. And they say that if the board sends these teachers, they'll protect them and provide them with the necessities that they require to teach in Hawaii. Unfortunately, the board is experiencing financial restraints and is unable to send a teacher at that time. And so the missionaries, the Ali'i hire a former missionary, William Richards, as a teacher of political economy and as an interpreter. And in effect, he is a new political advisor in the kingdom. He translates the writings on political economy of the ministers of the interior and experts of France, Great Britain, and America, and teaches this to the Ali'i. And he teaches that there are 3 paths to foreign mana, or authority: Christianity, Western law, and capitalism. And as I mentioned before in the historical background, that this collaboration leads to the formation of a constitution, which helps to secure Hawaiian independence and sovereignty within an increasingly politically dangerous time. In 1843, we see the Paulette Affair, when the British consul occupies Hawaii for 5 months and only restores Hawaiian sovereignty after independence is recognized in 1843, and it's restored. And there's a series of treaties that acknowledge Hawaiian independence, and these treaties articulate the reason for doing so. And those governments do so that taking into consideration the existence in the Sandwich Islands of a government capable of providing for the regularity of its relationships with foreign nations. It recognizes Hawaii as an independent nation state. And so the Ali'i were leading this change by learning Western forms of education and governance as a political strategy to resist foreign imperialism and secure these treaties. And my last finding is that Western education and knowledge become a crucial part of governance and leadership in the Hawaiian Kingdom. By 1843, there's an increasing number of foreigners in the government. There's William Richards, like I mentioned before, and they also hire Garrett Judd as an interpreter and the treasurer. And this triggers increased protests by the common people within Hawaii. An exchange documented by historian Kamako notes that the old men, who represent the common people, write a letter to the king, Kamehameha III, and they say, "The king has chosen foreign ministers, foreign agents. This is wrong. The Hawaiian people will be debased and the foreign exalted." Kamako responds and says he disapproves of the people's protests against foreign officials, since it is the desire of the rulers of Great Britain, France, and the United States of America to educate our government in their way of governing. And we ought therefore not to object to foreign officials if we cannot find chiefs of Hawaii learned enough for the office. And that you need to have these political understandings, you need to be fluent in the English language in order to be able to negotiate these diplomatic arrangements. The king himself responds and he says, "I earnestly desire to give places to the commoners and to the chiefs as they are able to do the work connected with the office." And he names a few of the Hawaiians who have been educated in existing schools that are in those positions. And he says, as soon as the young chiefs are sufficiently trained, I hope to give them the places, but they are not now able to become speakers in foreign tongues. And he therefore refuses to dismiss the foreign advisors and continues to maintain them as officials and translators in the government. So we see that having these Western understandings and command of the English language is crucial to political position and leadership in the Hawaiian Kingdom by 1843 and 1845. I'm sorry, I think it got a little overlapped. There's some cut off. But my further research, my case study, looks particularly at the Chiefs Children's School, which is established in 1839 for the education of the Hawaiian ali'i, or the ali'i children, and compares that with Punahou School, which was established in 1841 for the children of the missionaries. And I find that, I focus particularly on Punahou School, that we have notable political alumna, including 1/3 of the individuals who participated in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But we also have amazing Hawaiian scholars, Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana Ole, who becomes a representative of the territory and establishes the Hawaiian Homes Act. And so to summarize my findings, I have identified that the historical narrative promotes this false dichotomy between Hawaiian identity and Western education. And it treats culture as a zero-sum game that privileges the haole, or the foreigner. And from a settler mentality, education is a form of eradicating the heathen with civilized ideologies. And this is a form of erasure that narrates that one cannot actively be Hawaiian while also participating in Western education. And by looking at Hawaiian sources, we find that this is not the case, that in fact indigenous resistance comes in the form of Western education, but that it is a double-edged sword and that it is also simultaneously a tool of settler empowerment. And I think implications for this is that today, despite Hawaii being one of the most literate nations in 1850 with literacy rates of above 95%, today Hawaiians suffer disproportionately from educational disparities. And this is an effect of the ongoing dispossession of the Hawaiian people and overt forms of settler colonialism. But it's also the result of narratives such as this that we find that create this dissonance within education as Hawaiian students when you're in these spaces and you feel that you cannot simultaneously be Hawaiian and be pursuing Western knowledge. And so through this research, I have found that there's power in reclaiming histories and control of the narrative. As Indigenous peoples, we can determine what makes us Hawaiian and what is not. And I find that it is the use of this education that makes the difference, that you use this education to better your lahui, to better your people. And no matter what it is, if you're doing that, you are still Hawaiian. And that is very much contrary to the existing narrative that is here today. And that is my research that I found, and I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you.